Hi, my name is Dr. Catherine Moore McCallan, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Arts at UTRGV, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And we are excited to have with us today Dr. Kristopher Driggers to join us and reflect on his curatorial process for the reinstallation of the new Castor family wing of Latin American art at the Tucson Museum of Art. In a project that created an expansion to the museum's campus that opened in July 2020 this year. And in addition to providing a walkthrough of this exhibition, Dr. Driggers is going to address strategies that he used for drawing upon the expertise of members of the Tucson community to create a relevant multivocal exhibition. In addition, Dr. Driggers will reflect on how the museum approaches the history of its collection and other critical concerns related to rethinking the traditional canon and presenting the history of art from Latin America in museum settings in 2020. And we're honored to have been Chris's colleague for a few years at UTRGV while he was finishing his Ph.D. And we thank him for returning to speak on his expertise at the Center for Latin American Arts. And Chris received his undergraduate degree from Yale University in art history in 2011. And he recently finished his PhD from the University of Chicago, where his dissertation, The History of Idolatry and the Codex Duran Paintings, received the Feitler Prize for Best Dissertation in Art History. His recent publications include an essay in the journal Latin American Art and Visual Culture, and he has forthcoming articles from the Getty Research Institute, co-authored with Jeanette Peterson, and UNAM. And Chris is now the Bernard and Jeanette Schmidt Assistant Curator of Latin American Art at the Tucson Museum of Art. Please join us in welcoming Chris to present his lecture, Object Histories and Community Expertise, Curating Latin American Art in 2020. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCallan, for that introduction. It is such a pleasure to be talking to a group from UTRGV, a place that is near and dear to my heart, and especially to be talking to the Center for Latin American Art at the university, which I really just admire for all of the work that the center's doing to create space for Latin American art and to promote Latin American art in the Rio Grande Valley. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that you have some images to see as I begin this talk. The talk that I'm going to give today is essentially a reflection on the curatorial process for a major curatorial project that my institution, the Tucson Museum of Art, undertook and brought to completion this summer. We just opened at the end of July 2020, the new Castor family wing of Latin American art, which is actually the first expansion to the museum's physical space in the course of its history since 1975. It was a major addition to our campus for that reason. As the curator for this new space, my responsibilities included doing art historical research about the works of art in the collection, and also presenting them to the public in a way that would be accessible. But another and really important part of the project was figuring out ways to incorporate the histories of the objects in the collection, not only in their historical moment, but also today, and to think about how we could incorporate community expertise to make the exhibition a much richer presentation. What we wanted to do and what was really important to me as I was thinking about this show was that I wanted for the show to reflect interests, perspectives, and voices that were different from the perspective of an art historian curator. And so in my talk today, I'm going to talk about both of these kind of big aspects of the curatorial project. I'm going to talk both about the exhibition content and about the particular ways and strategies that we use to create an exhibition that was shaped by the community. The way that I'm going to organize my talk today is that in the first half, I'll discuss some of the major issues that I considered in association with this exhibition. And in the second half, what I plan to do is take us through a walkthrough of the show to talk about how its curation was ultimately shaped by those issues and those considerations. Much of what I'm going to discuss today, I should say, covers topics that we're still learning to understand. So while I'll discuss what we've done so far, I'll also point to some ways that I see the show continuing to evolve into the future. and sort of my hopes for how the conversation can grow and become even more wide and sort of embracing of our community in the future. So before I do anything else, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit for the history of art from Latin America at the Tucson Museum of Art. The museum has been around as an institution for over 95 years now. We'll celebrate our centennial in just a few years. And in the time that the museum has been collecting works of art, works that from what used to be called Pre-Columbian art, what today we call art of the ancient Americas, have always been really important in the DNA of the institution. At the end of the 1960s, when what was once an art center, the Tucson Art Center, when that institution was reconfigured as a museum, one of the founding donations of an art collection that sort of got the museum going as this newly formed institution was actually a gift of what was, again, at that time called Pre-Columbian art from Frederick Pleasance, donated beginning in 1965. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're thinking today about the Pleasance gift and about the particular histories of his collecting in terms of the objects that we have on view in the show when I get a little bit deeper into my talk. But this gives you a sense of what it used to look like sort of at the origins of the institution. And I think, and we'll eventually give you a sense of sort of where we've evolved from since then. Our museum hosts and holds a number of different collections. We're not an encyclopedic museum like the Met or like the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Instead, we think of our collections as really tailored to our local context already. We have a collection, for instance, a major collection of art of the American West that reflects on the sort of art traditions distinctive to Tucson in our area. We have collections of indigenous art reflecting both our situation, the situation of our institution on indigenous territories, and also the local communities that make up the city of Tucson. And then we also have collections of modern and contemporary art. And it's within this context of a kind of specific set of collecting practices that the museum is growing today. What you're seeing here is a projection for the Kasser family wing that was imagined back in 2017 as, again, this new addition to the museum specifically for Latin American art. The project came about through a partnership with the Kasser family, who are a Tucson-based family. The main sort of instigator of this project was Michael Kasser, who was a business leader in Tucson and who also has an extensive collection of art from ancient Latin America, especially strong in works of Maya art and Moche art. This comprises several hundred works of art from the ancient Americas. And the idea was that this project would include not only a new space for Latin American art, but also the promised gift and the long-term loan of two collections of ancient art. The Kasser collection and another Tucson-based collection, the Baker collection of ancient art. And looking at the images that you see here on the slide, you see some of the objects that I think of as some of the distinctive objects from this collection. There are really finely painted works in ceramic, like the two vessels that you see on the right, both Maya vessels, one early classic and the other late classic that tell stories. We see works in precious materials, like the Wari pendant in the lower left corner of this slide with spondylus shell and gold and turquoise and lapis lazuli, all these different materials. And then works of clay figural sculpture, like the West Mexican sculpture of a seated female sort of at the top middle, as well as the Olmec baby below. So some really interesting objects in these collections. And incorporating these collections alongside the museum's permanent collection of art from the ancient Americas has been really helpful in that it allows us to expand significantly the kind of story that we can tell about art from the ancient Americas. Our permanent collection of art from this area, while quite strong, does have some holes it sort of, it's not comprehensive in the sense that it covers every culture or every period, but the incorporation of these objects really helps us to do that and to tell a much richer story about this art history alongside that. But as we brought all these collections together and we started to think about how we would tell the story of art from ancient Latin America, and indeed from antiquity through the contemporary period, a number of important issues arose about thinking about how we were going to sort of situate this field. One of the very first issues was an issue around interpretation. So when I was hired into my position, one of the first things that I did as I went about trying to understand what kind of strategy would make sense for the Tucson Museum of Art was to talk to a number of the different stakeholders around the museum. And what I learned was that there was a perception at the Tucson Museum of Art that ancient art was inherently more challenging or perhaps more opaque than art from, for example, modern and contemporary periods. One of the observations, for example, was that some people around the museum, including docents or museum educators or museum visitors, felt that it was quite difficult. They sort of felt, I think, a kind of visceral challenge in the idea of trying to keep all of the different chronologies organized to create ways of understanding and differentiating between different cultures from the ancient Americas. And so it became quite clear, I think, or quite evident that the kind of chronological range of this field was perceived as challenging. One thing that I really noted at the same time and that I really appreciated was that many of these stakeholders expressed the idea that it was really important to appreciate the distinctiveness of all of the different traditions of the Americas, but the kind of breadth felt a little bit challenging. One of the problems with the previous presentation in this area too was that the art of the ancient Americas had long been presented, I think, with a curatorial strategy that spatially exacerbated some of the attitudes around these objects and their perceived inaccessibility to a museum visitor. In the old Latin American gallery, this was you're looking at the previous space just before the construction of the new wing here. Works of ancient art were displayed in these long, massive built-in cases. One of them for the art of Mesoamerica. This includes ancient Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and then one for the intermediate zone and the Andes. Selections from the museum's colonial collection were also hung in the same gallery. But aside from the masks that you're seeing in the image on the left, few of the works in the space dated after the mid-19th century. So there were kind of few bridges, I think, to visitors who were primarily interested in modern and contemporary work into this kind of historical period. There's a few problems, I think, to note with this style of presentation. The biggest problem is that it's very difficult to change out objects when they're being presented in these massive built-in cases because of the kind of physical challenges around installation, right? It's not the most flexible style of casework for presenting works of art. And because of that, the space doesn't have an ability to kind of change in an agile or flexible way. And I think that the presentation of ancient art in a space like this one starts to look just a little bit frozen into the time of a curator's selections around the works, right? Whereas what I think we aspired to was a version of presenting ancient art that would feel more kind of alive to its moment and where one could expect the possibility that things would rotate out on a fairly regular basis. Because of the style of these cases too, it is really hard to see works fully in the round in this kind of case. So a visitor has to sort of see the work using the view selected by a curator, but can't fully circumambulate around a case, which I think also yields some difficulty in accessing the material. There were also, I should say, very few interpretive texts written in this gallery. They were mostly tombstone labels, which means labels that have just the title given to a work, the culture that the work is associated with, time periods, information about donors, but there isn't a descriptive text that sort of helps you to interpret the work. And that was one of the things too that I felt was really important, that there would be quite a lot of text actually in the new wing. So the addition of the new wing offered opportunities to rethink the visuality of our exhibition strategy. And as we moved towards a new exhibition aesthetic, we also started thinking about this show and its participation in a broader kind of cultural conversation about how museums approach material heritage that seemed to be in 2019 at least, coming to a really kind of interesting point. With the opening of a number of exhibitions around the US, we saw groups really advocating for a vision of curatorial work that would be inclusive of forms of knowledge and expertise that were not just the forms of knowledge of expertise of an art historian curator. Instead, we saw in a number of institutions and a number of specific exhibitions that it became increasingly important to find ways to incorporate the kinds of knowledge produced by non-art historian communities that could enrich understandings of objects and create all kinds of different ways to build sort of relevant bridges to this work. And that was certainly something that we wanted to have it happen in this exhibition, and something that I felt really strongly that should be a part of our curatorial strategy here in this new presentation. And so in the summer of 2019, the museum formed a community group that was meant to meet every month for a 12-month period leading up to the opening of the new wing. There were 11 different members of this group, nearly all of them identified as either Indigenous or Latinx or both. Some identified as members of descendant communities from traditions that would be represented in the museum's exhibition. For example, members of descendant Maya or Nawa communities. One member of this community group was one member of this group was a keeper of Indigenous medicinal knowledge. Another was an activist within Tucson's community of refugees from Guatemala. There were members of the media. There were people who were involved in the creation of bilingual curriculum for Tucson. There were community members who, for example, were active in the Latinx business community in Tucson. And so we were really looking for lots of different kinds of expertise and people who were connected to our city in ways that would help us as an institution to build bridges between the exhibition and between the city more broadly. We met every month beginning in sort of mid-2019 through the rise of the COVID pandemic in March, when that sort of shut down our meetings. But even in that period of time, we were able to learn a lot from this committee that helped us to create a better and stronger exhibition. The first task of this group was to think carefully about the structure of the exhibition as a whole. By the time of the first meeting, I had adopted an overarching question for the show. And the question that I sort of came up with is the question that you see on the screen here. How did artists from the ancient Americas use art to express the ideas that mattered to them? A question like this one centers the agency of Indigenous artists, and it has the potential to train visitors' eyes on works themselves in a way that I think had not been true so much in the past exhibition. The Community Advisory Committee helped me to think through how to organize the exhibition under this theme. In our conversations, the ideas that kept coming up were ideas around showing that ancient traditions were still living traditions, showing Indigenous communities as resilient, and honoring the Indigenous communities in the American Southwest today, where some community members claim Mesoamerican heritage as their own. Another major concern of this group was around the interpretation of objects. The show adopted a strategy that we call community voices labels. where objects that are chosen to be kind of highlighted have a text written by a community member, sometimes someone who is on our committee, but sometimes also written by other people who we thought had interesting connections to works or who found that certain works resonated with them. And so it's an opportunity to see knowledge about the works of art presented, not just from an art historical framework, but also from the kind of coming from the place of the expertise of the label writer. And I'm showing you an example of what one of those looks like here. I'll actually tell you a little bit more about it when we do our walkthrough of the space in a little later in this talk. The advisory committee's roles also included helping us to think through issues around the programming for the exhibition. Back before COVID, we had anticipated that alongside the opening of this new wing, we would have a really rich slate of in-person programs related to the wing, including art making activities, public lectures, musical events, all kinds of different performances. We were thinking through a lot of different ways to bring programs that would help to enrich the space. And I think this is actually one of the areas where the committee was tremendously helpful, in that committee members were very diligent in reminding us to think about the audience for our programs, and in reminding us that museums, if not sensitive, risked commodifying knowledge around commodifying knowledge around Indigenous traditions in ways that we certainly did not want to participate in. And so we had some really interesting conversations as a group about how to effectively program in ways that would be equitable and just. There were also conversations in this committee group about some of the different terminologies that we use when we talk about our collection. You see here that a list of some of those that came up over and over again. Pre-Columbian, we had an extensive conversation over several meetings about this term versus the term Ancient Americas. Some committee members felt very strongly that Pre-Columbian was not an appropriate term for the collection, and we ultimately agreed with that in the sense that we do not want to refer to the cultures of the Ancient Americas as sort of pre-anything, but rather to kind of grant or to recognize the autochthonous creation of Indigenous traditions in our terminology. We also talked about terms like myths, narratives, and stories, which had kind of charged meanings in different contexts. And we, in conversation with this committee, ultimately referred to many of these or opted for narratives or stories instead of myths. And then we had conversations about whether the terminology around deities in ancient art from the Americas was the right conversation, or whether we should instead be using Indigenous terminologies, which was really important. And throughout the space, where possible, or where they're sort of known to me in my label writing, when writing the institutional labels, I tended to choose Indigenous terminologies and explain them where possible in sort of response to this committee directive. So what I've talked about so far are a number of issues that the committee focused on, which were largely issues around interpretation and programming and terminology and so on. But important part about the ethics of this exhibition too was figuring out within the broader structure of the museum how to talk about issues around the history of objects and their relationship to cultural patrimony. As some of you know, in the field of the art of the ancient Americas, just like in many other fields of art, both Western and non-Western, the acquisition of objects is informed by a 1970 UNESCO Convention against illicit trafficking, which was meant to halt the movement of objects that had been taken from their countries of origin through either coercion or looting or other kind of extractive practices. Most museums make decisions about the ethics of their collection of cultural objects based on national guidelines too that come from the Association of Art Museum Directors, which help the institution decide which objects can be collected and exhibited ethically and which cannot. But one of the things that I sort of became aware of as I was curating this show was that while there were really sort of clear guidelines about collecting, one of the things that I think the field could think more about in terms is how institutions actually talk to publics about these decisions, right? There aren't necessarily guidelines about how the museum should interpret the collecting of objects for a museum going public. And one of the things that I felt was really important was that we actually bring into the space of the exhibition some parts of this conversation around the decisions that institutions and curators make surrounding collecting and around exhibition of objects of cultural heritage. I'm giving you an example of an object here, which has a pretty interesting collections history. And I show this to say that one of the decisions that we made for this exhibition was to actually move forward in being transparent about what it is that we knew about the history of objects collections on the exhibition, or about objects provenance on the labels that appear in the exhibition. In some cases, I think that displaying the provenance information can be helpful for interpreting the role of an object in constructing ideas about art from the ancient Americas in the 20th century. That's the case in this example that we have here, a clay sculpture from West Mexico. The work depicts an elite figure who sits on a litter with a female companion. They're carried by a number of attendants. It's a deeply fragmentary object, broken and glued back together by a previous owner. But the sculpture's material presence belies, I think, its importance in shaping the image of art from the ancient Americas in the 20th century. The provenance information that we give on the label, and you're seeing an example of that here on this slide, shows that this little object, this diminutive object, has a relatively outsized role in the 20th century conception of Mesoamerican art. One can trace how the work moved through major collections, how it was put on exhibition multiple times over decades, and then its sort of itinerary as it moved ultimately to a private collection in Tucson. Although in some sense the provenance entries on the label are raw data, I also see these labels as a tool for the interpretation of the object's histories, as they implicitly do the work of explaining how the museum made choices around objects for exhibition. Not every object has as thick of a provenance entry as this object that we're looking at here on the slide. But in cases where the works have less, the museum has presented what we know in order to make this, again, part of the kind of interpretation of the object that we offer institutionally for the public. Another case where we engage more deeply, I think, about the provenance issues in our collection is around the Tucson Museum of Art stela, a work created in a style associated with very early Mesoamerican history on the Gulf Coast. This is a work that was gifted to the museum by Frederick Pleasance in 1965. And the work depicts a standing bearded male figure holding what appears to be perhaps a throwing stick or atlatl, although it's a little bit, some of the content of this object or the content of the image is a little bit disputed. And this is one of the cases, I think, where we know quite a great deal about the object's itinerary before it entered our collection. We know that the stela was sold to Frederick Pleasance in the 1930s by the art dealer Pierre Matisse, who is the son of the modernist painter Henri. And recent archival work by my colleague Megan O'Neill has continued to kind of dig back further into the history of this object so that today we know even a little bit more about its itinerary in Mexico before it came to the United States. The label for this object attempts to tell this history, thinking critically about how the sculpture moved through collections and even formed part of the public discourse of Mesoamerican art when it was displayed in a major US traveling exhibition. This is before Cortez, one of the kind of major exhibitions of Mesoamerican art early in this field's, or relatively early in this field's history. In short, I think that as an institution, we haven't sort of yet fully realized the ambition of talking about provenance and understanding it in all of its complexity, but we have taken the step of making it a subject of exhibition itself, right? And I think that that is an important first step for us to take as kind of understanding all of these issues that make an exhibition possible and that go into the formation of a show. So having laid out now a few of the kind of big sweep of issues surrounding this exhibition, what I'm going to do now is walk you through this space and talk a little bit about how some of the issues that I've discussed so far actually informed the hang of, or the installation of, our Latin American collections. When you first enter the Castor family wing, you see this sort of broad view onto these 5 different bays. The first of these is dedicated to modern and contemporary Latin American and Latinx art. The second is for art from Mesoamerica. The third is for art from Mesoamerica and the intermediate zone. We then pass to space for Andean art. And then finally, the last space displays some of our colonial collection. And so we will see that momentarily. The modern and contemporary bay is anchored by 3 large format works that build iconographic connections with some of the ancient work displayed elsewhere in the gallery. One of the most striking works in the bay is a 2019 piece by Patrick Martinez, an LA-based artist who has lately been engaged in making a series of mixed media works that reclaim the images from the ancient site of Cacaxtla, but taking them and imagining them as part of the visuality of a working class urban neighborhood in Los Angeles. Patrick's work emulates the appearance of the facade of a mom and pop business in East LA, complete with neon imagery and the work, complete with neon imagery. The mural painted on the side of this, like I mentioned, references the art of the site of Cacaxtla, where eagle warriors painted around the 10th century AD flank the entrance to a palace building or another elite structure at the center of this small polity. In Patrick's words, these ancient paintings represent what he describes as among the most eloquent statements from the history of the people of the Americas. Painting them onto the side of an imagined urban facade, Patrick claims the heritage and ownership of that eloquence for the people who live in working class neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Another work from the permanent collection that creates some kind of interesting conversation with our ancient collection is the painting that we have here on this back wall by Enrique Chagoya, who has created his version of a Mesoamerican codex, or a painted book from ancient Mesoamerica. In his case, he's created a painted codex that addresses issues around migration. And you see a couple of details from that larger work here, where you see some interesting intermixing of styles, but he sort of takes this ancient format and shows that it still has quite a lot of vitality, that it can still be used to talk about issues that are to the Latinx community and many communities today. Well, I sort of opened this talk by mentioning some of the ethical considerations around the collection of ancient art. I also want to say that there were also some important considerations here as well in the modern and contemporary space. For one, our curatorial team felt that it was really important that Latinx artists be represented in the space alongside Latin American artists, particularly in light of kind of recent observations that oftentimes Latin American artists have more visibility than do Latinx artists in the US. And so one of the things that we really worked to do here was to create that kind of equity and inclusion in this new gallery. At the same time, I also have been thinking a lot about the fact that, well, in this hang, we really privileged images that connect iconographically directly to the ancient past, sort of, for example, with Patrick sort of emulating or replicating in a way the Kakashla painting on his work. I think it's also important that we make sure that we don't privilege exclusively artists who think about kind of historical styles, but instead that we think about being represented for artists who work in a lot of different visual languages in order to create kind of the strongest possible show. So from the contemporary bay, we pass into the art of ancient Mesoamerica. Some of the cases here are organized in a culture by culture presentation, grouping objects, for example, from the Olmecs, the Maya, and the Aztecs. But then there are also cases that group works thematically, with groupings that include a piece on the Mesoamerican ball game, a grouping about in images of Mesoamerican women, and a grouping that highlights painted Maya drinking vessels. I want to take a close look at one of these groupings for a moment in order to give you an idea of how the community voices labels informed the presentation of the work. We're looking here at a case about images of Mesoamerican women, each associated with Veracruz, and perhaps all created during the Classic period. So around 600 to 900 AD or so. These are sculptures in clay. A figure at the back left has bitumen inlay for the eyes. Another wears large necklaces and displays ornamentally filed teeth, perhaps. Another figure still at the front wears an elaborate garment with rich textile design. And another still has what seem to be surviving pigment traces, although one would really want to toss to be sure of this. I wrote an art historical label for this grouping of objects, where I talked about Mesoamerican understandings of women and images of women in Mesoamerica, which included kind of thinking about ideas around women's work, for example, being important to the organization of the cosmos and bringing order to the cosmos based on kind of scholarly understandings of images of women in Mesoamerica. But in the community voice label, which I showed you a little bit earlier, we had a rather different kind of reflection on what these works might mean. And I want to read this one to you, in part because it was written by Alejandro Macias, who was a former UTRGV faculty member and who I know is familiar to many of the people in this group. And so let me read you what Alejandro Macias wrote about this sculpture here, an image of a mother and child. He writes, "I was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, along the US-Mexico border, and lived there most of my life. Mother and child reminds me of home, most importantly of my mother, who texts and calls me daily since moving to Tucson in August 2019. She's been a strong foundation in my life and has been supportive of all my decisions, including the move to Tucson for my position at the University of Arizona. I can safely say that I've had a fortunate life because of her strong will and determination. It also reminds me of the many mothers who sacrifice what little they have to give their children a better future. With the separation of families currently happening at our borders, it's not difficult for me to empathize with their struggle. This work has the power to reach memories and ignite empathy. It's a reminder that art is timeless and universal as it resonates across all walks of life." So with labels like these, I think that it's important that they bring forms of knowledge that are not strictly within kind of the art historical canon around information around art from the ancient Americas, but they create points of access to the object for museum visitors who may not find that art historical or anthropological interpretation sufficiently relatable or perhaps even sufficiently relevant. One of the things that I really appreciate about this label too is that it interprets an ancient work in a kind of political lens, which I think really should be sort of available to this work. We want for the work to feel kind of alive to its moment and to feel like a place where people have an opportunity to reflect on our moment and not to be sort of frozen in time, even though certainly our institutional labels do think about kind of the sort of factuality of the historical past. There's another illuminating community voices label for the object that we have here, which was written by Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, who is a Kickapoo, Comanche, and Nawa scholar, who before embarking on an academic career, trained in indigenous medicine. The work comes from the late classic period, probably created between 600 and 800, and it represents women who administer ritual enemas to their male counterparts in a court dominated by an enthroned god of the underworld. The museum's label reflects on Maya vessels as surfaces for storytelling, where narratives about the deities set in palace spaces appear to have been shared widely throughout the Maya world. But Dr. Gonzalez's label expands on this perspective, and here's what she writes. Her label's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it at length because I think it is just really interesting. So, ceremonial purge, the physical as spiritual and ceremonial. This scene depicts a ceremonial enema administered by a female knowledge keeper. The physical is spiritual and the material is ceremonial. Numerous Maya vessels depict ceremonials and medicinal cleansings through herbs and liquid compounds administered through the anus with ceremonial vessels. Medicinal enemas in Mesoamerica addressed ailments such as hemorrhoids, diarrhea, and illness within the blood. Sometimes powerful concoctions to access sacred site were administered through ceremonial enemas. The vessels, painted with ceremonial forms, convey the powers that imbued time from cosmological realms. Contained within these formulas of thought are energetic formulas for transformation. Layers of power and medicine imbued both the medicines and the vessels based on prayers and knowledge used to gather the ingredients administered in the ceremonial cleansings. The creation of the ceremonial container carried its own spiritual protocols. The Mesoamerican past continues to live in the present, or continues in the present in the import that Mexican abuelas give to la purga. My grandma Carmen often administered the dreaded but highly effective purga and the ayudas using herbs, warm water, and her famous red hot water bottle. My great-grandpa Boni, a well-known Nahua Mexican curandero, employed a black drink that cured my grandfather of excessive drinking by purging him so intensely that he never drank again. Oops. I think that the value of having a narrative like Patricia's in the gallery speaks for itself. Her account of the images on this vessel is grounded in her intimate knowledge of the purgas, as well as in the family history of the purga that cured her grandfather of his addiction. As with Alex's reflection on the mother and child figurine, Patricia's text expands the possibilities for the vessel itself, allowing it to speak to a time and place removed from the moment of the object by over 1 millennium. Following one of my past presentations of this curatorial approach, I was asked about how I felt about sort of bringing in these not historical interpretations of objects and putting them on kind of an equal footing with an institutional label. And in response to this point, I feel that it is true that a community voices label functions outside of the conventions of an art historical institutional label. But that's sort of exactly why I think they're necessary. They revivify objects where an institutional presentation otherwise risks freezing them in historical time. Sort of staying within the Mesoamerican area, one more object received a particularly interesting community voices label. In this case, the writer addressed the work by writing a poem that would be displayed next to the sculpture. The object is a work in stone from the Maya world, created during the classic period. Its precise find site is known, but it's probably associated with the site of Tonina or the area around the Usumacinta River. It's a standing male figure who's depicted on a stone prism, wearing necklaces and a head device shaped like the head of an animal, perhaps an animal like a jaguar. He holds objects in his hands, and there's a hieroglyphic inscription that runs along the back that at least one interpreter saw as a title, the term Chok, the name for a young lord. The Community Voices label for this sculpture was written by Patria Soy Barcelos Sanders, who's both a leader in Tucson's Guatemalan community and also a poet who works at the University of Arizona in research and alongside many other responsibilities. Patricia emigrated to Tucson from Guatemala as a young person and studied and became involved with her Maya heritage as part of her education. This is the poem that Patricia wrote after her considering the sculpture. She writes, "I hear my thoughts in the wind, my words curling in a warm mist in your ear. Do you hear me? My bare feet on the ground, walking from Ishimche to Yashha. I hear the volcanoes talking, warning us, guarding us. Do not fear, I will be your shield. The incense covering the jungle, the jaguar roaming, the altar ready, order coming." This is a poem that extends the aesthetic range of the object, enveloping the stone sculpture with the imagery of sensuous detail. Synesthetically, Patricia writes that thoughts are heard, words curl into warm mist, incense covers the jungle, and at last she leads us to a moment of buildup and expectation, the altar ready, order coming. This poem, in response to the standing male figure from the classic period, emphatically underlines the anachronistic nature of encounters with older art in the museum. On exhibition, the work is placed out of time, brought from the first millennium into 2021. And while the institution's interpretation might aspire to rebuild historical context around the object, as a museum, we also kind of have the freedom to open interpretation to community members like Patricia, who can create their own sensuous histories around our collection's objects. Moving forward into the next bay, we have our collection of Andean art, and I'll just show a couple of things here. We have our works again arranged in a scheme where some of them are dedicated to particular cultures and others take up themes that are common to a number of works. We have, for example, a case that's dedicated to drinking rituals in the Andes, which you're seeing a little bit of here, a kind of close-up shot. We have cases around the idea of portraiture and moche art with these wonderful portrait bottles that we have here. And then we have a few highlight objects like the moche copper fox that I show you here. And then just to give you a little bit of a taste, I know we have kind of time considerations to think about, but to give you a little bit of a taste of the last bay in the space, that's a space that's dedicated to our Spanish colonial paintings collection. One of the things that we're working sort of actively to do is to think about issues around the production of colonial paintings and the context in which they were made. And so some of the labels talk, for example, about how colonial paintings creatively reinterpreted European models coming, for example, out of prints, like the one that we have on the left. This is our painting on the right of St. Apollonius. Excuse me, an 18th century painting from the Cusco region. And we, of course, in this space want to emphasize that our colonial paintings are not sort of derivative copies of European models, but instead that they are, in fact, creative and oftentimes ingenious reinterpretations of European models. Also helping us to think more about the production of works of art in our collection. We're currently undergoing a conservation project on a painting that we acquired relatively recently for the collection. This is a painting of the sorrowful mother, the Madre Dolorosa, that's currently undergoing a major conservation project. And because I saw the progress on this relatively recently, I just wanted to share a little bit of where this painting is in its, in that process, and we'll be sort of changing out the colonial space to include conserved works, newly conserved works like this one before long. So by way of concluding this presentation, I want to offer a brief kind of summary reflection on what I've learned through the process of curating this exhibition. And so now that I have sort of created an exhibition that aspired to speak in multiple voices, I've seen that a multifocal curatorial approach can create many points of entry to a corpus of objects by recognizing complementary forms of expertise beyond the expertise of art historians. Yet I also see that there are a lot of possibilities that this exhibition has still left on the table for taking that vision even further. One of the things that I wonder is what might have happened if the exhibition had been truly community-centered and community-steered from its genesis. If, for example, art historians or non-art historians rather had been entrusted to select and arrange objects rather than to kind of engage in a discussion of a show that had already been formed. I wonder too what narratives might have emerged through a different or more expansive configuration of this advisory committee. And we will in fact continue to grow and expand this group as we move forward. I also feel an awareness that there are still highly local narratives of Latinx and Latin American art for which the wing might further create space in the future, given the kind of robust and really interesting range of artistic expressions that we see in our own Arizona context. So ultimately, I think we've taken a number of really important first steps with this installation of the wing, even as our vision is to continue to grow this space in pursuit of the ambition of really creating a show and a space that's completely reflective of and relevant to our local community. And with that, I sort of conclude my comments.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was so interesting. We have a few questions that have been coming through on the chat, and I wanted to ask if you might answer a few of these. Let's see here. Where are my questions? Oh, sorry. Lucia Abramovich from the San Antonio Museum of Art and Julia Burtonshaw from the LACMA both had a similar question. Lucia wrote, "Thank you for sharing your insights and congratulations on a thoughtful and beautiful gallery. Could you speak a little more about your process with putting together the community group? How did you recruit participants and what incentivized them to participate in this project?"
Yeah, that's a great question. So in forming this group, we really reached out to people that we had already partnered with in certain other contexts. This wasn't our very first project in building connections with our community, but something that instead we've been working on for many, many years now. And so working with our community engagement department, we found people who had already expressed an interest in helping us to build more connections in our exhibitions. Kind of thinking about who we thought would be effective community advisory committee members. We wanted, of course, people who were connected in their communities in meaningful ways, who could help us to bring people to the museum and to spread our ideas and to generate interest because they were already sort of plugged into their communities. And so those were certainly important considerations. And also we wanted people who were not strictly academics or not strictly in kind of working in business or whatever have you. We wanted that to be kind of diverse as well, alongside an interest in telling a robust story around Latin American art. In terms of their incentive, these were committee members who very generously volunteered their time and who understood the importance, I think, of seeing a community-based exhibition at the museum. But they were volunteers, they weren't compensated for this work. And so we're just really grateful that they volunteered what I think really is labor to helping us make the show better.
Absolutely. And this second question is related somewhat to that first question. This is by one of our graduate students, Alexis Ramos. She asked, how has the community responded to your community voice labels?
Yeah, so far, all of the responses have been overwhelmingly positive, I think. I think that our visitors, and not just our visitors, but also people who volunteer for the museum and who are around the museum regularly, I think that they appreciate seeing a perspective that's not simply an art historian's perspective in the presentation of the show. I mean, to kind of draw on one anecdote, we had one label writer, for example, who wasn't a committee member, but who generously gave the time to write a label, and at the opening of the show brought family and friends to see, in part, like to see the label, right? So I think it's a really great opportunity to help us to bring the show to a wider audience. And so far it's been, I think, really universally well received. I know certainly that they're some of my favorite labels in the show.
Thank you. And another student of ours who was a former National Gallery of Art intern, Daniel Imbong, he asked this question. When I worked in Washington, D.C. as an NGA fellow, I saw in the National Museum of the American Indian photos of models and photos from Vogue Paris and other magazines showcasing Native American inspired dress within a contemporary fashion context. And there were no labels from the designers and or Native American community members. And using some of the strategies you've discussed, how can you suggest for a museum to support local Native American artists and the reinterpretation of their art in contemporary works while also respecting intellectual property rights?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I haven't seen the show, so you won't be able to speak specifically to the show, but as a general principle, I think that we're seeing more and more the importance of strengthening shows by reaching out to communities early and by having kind of consistent connections with community members. So I would, you know, and every show has different needs and different, and the need for different kinds of expertise. But I think I would sort of recommend that if one wants to sort of sincerely build these connections, one do it as close to the inception of a show as possible in order to really make sure that it's shaped by people who need to have a say in the way that works are presented.
Mm-hmm, great point. And then the last question was a question for me. I had a question about connecting beyond the museum walls. Your community voice labels and so much of the way you've thought about this show to me is so appropriately interested in engaging and the public. And I wanted to ask, how does your reinstallation of the collection and your community engaged labels connect with your community outside of the space of your museum?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. And certainly I know that since COVID has forced us to rethink so much of how we present our collection, we have like really recently turned to thinking about more digital presentations of the exhibition. We are presenting things with video, and you know, we even try to get people connected to the museum by sending out like art making packets to people who may be interested in creating work, but won't be able to come to the museum to be part of a program, especially since our programs are so reduced right now. So we are thinking about all kinds of different strategies for connecting beyond the museum's walls. And, you know, one day I would like to think about even exhibition strategies beyond the museum walls, right? To actually sort of using our collection, perhaps through strategic loans, to bring the museum outside of our space through partnership with other spaces. But that'll have to kind of come further down the line, I think.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really, really inspiring. And we look forward to sharing it on our Center for Latin American Arts YouTube channel for colleagues, friends, museum lovers, and anyone who might want to watch it in the future, because we really believe you're changing the future with your innovation. So thank you, Chris, for a great talk.
And thank you so much for having me. It's really always a pleasure to be associated in any way with the Center for Latin American Art. So wonderful to be with you.
Thank you, Chris.